Hi there, my name is Ben, and I'm here doing a video series on the Arcane Splice Pauper deck, or Petal Festival as some people like to call it. So the namesake of the deck is the two cards Market Festival and Petals of Insight, but I don't actually really care for the art on Market Festival, so I actually choose to run Dawn's Reflection instead, which is a functionally the same card as just got a different art that I prefer. So that's why I call the deck Arcane Splice. Instead of Petal Festival. But the name is kind of caught on as Petal Festival. But you can call it whatever you like. So anyway, the goal of this deck is to storm off or essentially storm off and kill your opponent by drawing lots of cards and generating enough mana to Kyrex Torch your opponent in the face. And the way that you do that is by putting a lot of enchantments that will add more mana whenever a land is tapped for mana. You put a lot of those enchantments onto one single land, or a mega land as I like to call it. Usually it's a forest. In fact, almost 100% of the time it's going to be a forest. And after that, you will play lots of draw spells that are arcane cards as well. And you splice Psychic Puppetry onto it using the untap effect from it to untap your land, your mega land, and continuing to draw through your deck while generating mana and playing more enchantments onto your land. And essentially, you will eventually create enough or generate enough mana to kill your opponent. So to run down the list, we've got 4 copies of Evolving Wilds, 2 Terramorphic Expanse, and 1 Ash Barrens, as well as 7 forests and 4 islands for the mana base. So the reason that we've got such a clunky, or not clunky, but like wonky looking mana base is that we want lots of fetch lands because we need to be hitting forests for Utopia Sprawl. So we can't really choose to run Thornwood Falls or anything like that. And the reason we only run 1 Ash Barrens is that Ash Barrens is great in the stage where we're trying to combo off because we can use the basic land cycling effect, the shuffle effect, without actually having to play a land. So it can be really good. But in the early game, when you're tight on mana or you don't have another land in your hand or any situation like that, Ash Barrens can be a dead card and not very good, which is why we only run 1. So we've got 6 copies of the Evolving Wilds effect to search for our forest. We only run 4 islands, despite the fact that most of this deck is blue, actually. But the reason for that is that all the enchantments that we're going to be putting onto our forest are going to be tapping for blue, with the one exception of a wild growth. So we actually have plenty of blue sources in this deck, although it may not quite seem like it. Running down through some of the 1 mana cards, we've got 4 copies of Preordain and 3 copies of Brainstorm, so just 7 1 mana cantrips. These are really to help streamline the deck and just increase overall consistency. They can be played at any stage of the game when you're comboing off, or in the early game stages when you're trying to set up. They're really, really good. The reason we don't run... and so Brainstorm is actually really good in this deck because we incidentally already run so many fetches, so we can actually afford to play Brainstorm instead of, like, say, Ponder. And Brainstorm can be really powerful here because when you're comboing off, you can put some of the dead cards that are in your hand back on top of the library and then shuffle them away with either something like Peer Through the Depths or an Evolving Wilds effect or many other things, or even a Preordain, actually. And that's why we actually run Preordain instead of Ponder here. So since we're running Brainstorm, Preordain just gives us more value in conjunction than a Ponder would. So we can scry the 2 cards from the Brainstorm to the bottom. And that's pretty much the 7 mana, or the 7 cantrips that we have. We've also got 3 Reach Through Mists, but I wouldn't really say these are cantrips as much as these are combo pieces. So these are actually like the weakest arcane cards in the deck. They're essentially just cycling themselves, but they do fill a very specific function in that they only cost 1 mana. So when you're splicing Psychic Puppetry onto them, you're paying a total of 2 blue mana to untap your land and draw a card, which can be pretty critical when you're in the early stages of the combo and you don't have a lot of mana to be working with. You can be in a situation where a Reach Through Mists is the only arcane spell that you can actually play to untap your lands. And Reach Through Mists is pretty good in that situation. So we only run 3 though because it's not that great otherwise, but it does fill a certain niche in the deck. Next up, we got 4 Utopia Sprawl. It's just an incredibly broken card. If you've ever played with it before, it's just so good. You always choose blue as your color. Never choose green. That's a mistake. And essentially, it's I guess you could consider it kind of like a mana dork, except in this deck it's way more powerful. So some of the old lists for Arcane Splice used to run Simic Growth Chamber, and I actually have pulled Simic Growth Chamber from the lists entirely to focus on Utopia Sprawl, and there's a couple reasons for that. So Simic Growth Chamber essentially has an enchantment stapled onto it to begin with, so it already comes onto the field essentially with an enchantment on it. But you can't play it until turn 2, which means that the first time that you are actually going to be able to have enough mana to actually enchant the Simic Growth Chamber with something like a Fertile Ground is turn 3 at the very earliest, which is just too slow for the deck. And so I actually have removed Simic Growth Chambers entirely from the deck in order to play Utopia Sprawls. And another thing about Simic Growth Chamber was that if you were comboing off and you were drawing your Simic Growth Chambers, if you had already used your land drop for the turn, they're essentially dead in your hand, and you can't do anything with them other than choose to discard them, basically. Whereas Utopia Sprawl will actually, if you draw them while you're comboing off, they're not dead at all. In fact, they will make your Mega Land bigger, and they will benefit your combo even more. So this is really streamlined the deck by adding Utopia Sprawl instead of Simic Growth Chamber. And it has opened up the deck to be able to win on turn 3 now as well. So usually you combo off on turn 4 or turn 5, but with the addition of Utopia Sprawl, it's now possible to combo off on turn 3. So next up, we got a copy of Wild Growth. Wild Growth is basically a bad Utopia Sprawl here. We use it just to, sometimes you need a 1 mana enchantment effect, and there aren't really any other Fertile Grounds. Like if there were another Fertile Ground effect at 2 mana, I would probably replace the Wild Growth with it. But since Fertile Ground is basically alone in the 2 converted mana cost enchantment category, which I chose to add a 1 of as a Wild Growth. This is kind of a flex spot though, so you could add maybe a 4th Brainstorm or something that you choose. But I like the Wild Growth just because it will increase the odds of you starting to actually generate mana and increase the amount of mana that you're actually generating with every tap of your Mega Lands while you're comboing off. So we don't want to see it too much though, because we want our Mega Land to be tapping for a critical amount of blue, and so anything that's not contributing to that is not exactly a great place to be. So next up, we got 4 copies of Peer Through Depths, which is basically an impulse on steroids. It's just really good. It's an arcane spell. The only thing that you have to worry about here is that it cannot find enchantments for when you're trying to set up in the early game, so you got to watch out. But other than that, it's just a really strong card. Next up is Psychic Puppetry, which is the combo engine for the deck. It's really good. It's because you don't actually have to be playing it, so your opponent can't counter the untap effect. They have to counter the draw spell, and if you have more draw spells in your hand, then you're pretty okay. So it's a really good engine, and you also can use it in a pinch to tap down an opponent's Gurmag Angler or Ulamog's Crusher if you're just trying to buy yourself 1 more turn or something like that by splicing it onto an instant spell on your opponent's beginning of combat. So next up is Ideas Unbound, which I like to refer to as essentially a Ancestral Recall for 2 blue, because it is when you're comboing off. And so that's kind of a caveat, though, for the card as well, though, is that when you're not comboing off, Ideas Unbound is also kind of a weak card, not really the best card that you want to see. It's not bad. Like if you have a lot of dead cards in your hand, it can be pretty good to kind of discard some of the stuff that you want to get rid of and find some more gas in the early game when you're trying to set up or something like that. But when you're comboing off, this card is literally the best arcane spell in your deck. It's so good. It's just, until you've played with it, don't underestimate it, I guess. It's really good. Next up is Fertile Ground. It's essentially it fills the spot of Utopia Sprawl in this deck. It just costs 1 more mana, and the benefit that we get out of that 1 additional mana cost is that we can actually cast Kyrex Torch with it, since it can tap for red or blue. So it's a good card, and you should always run 4. Next is Compulsive Research. It's a 4 of in this deck. It's just really, really strong. There just aren't enough good arcane spells to be worth running in this deck, that we decided to run some other forms of basic card advantage and things like that. So for when we're comboing off, and Compulsive Research fits the bill perfectly. So it's a really strong card. If you've never played with it before, don't underestimate it. It's card advantage plus good amount of dig. So I really, really like it. Next is Sift Through Sands, which kind of fills a similar role to Compulsive Research, but the reason that we only run 2 copies of Sift Through Sands is that Sift Through Sands costs 3 mana. So when you're splicing Psychic Puppetry onto Sift Through Sands, it's going to cost a total of 4 mana, including 3 blue. So that means that your Mega Land has to be tapping for at least 3 blue and at least 4 mana total in order to be mana neutral. So just that when you're untapping your land, you're not even generating mana, you are just staying at the same amount of mana. So it's kind of a hefty requirement for the deck to start comboing off, and you usually don't want to see it until you're in the mid to late stages of the combo, when you really just need more untap effects. But it is still a good card, and it does actually have a secondary effect in that you can search your library, even though we can't run the Unspeakable since it's a rare. You can search your library and fail to find, which essentially gives you a shuffle effect. So you shouldn't use this in conjunction with Brainstorm, though, because Brainstorm is going to put the 2 cards that you don't want to see back on the top of your library. Sift Through Sands is immediately going to draw those 2 cards again if you try and use the shuffle effect from Sift Through Sands, because the shuffle effect occurs after the draw 2 cards. So it's not very good with Brainstorm, but it does give you a shuffle effect. So you dig through your deck really, really fast in this deck. So sometimes what you can see is that you may have put 2 Kyrex Torch or a Petals of Insight or something like that on the bottom of the deck, and you want to shuffle your deck again just to increase the odds of drawing those because you're at the stage in the game where you want to be drawing those. So sometimes Sift Through Sands can have that effect. But overall, you're not going to really need the shuffle effect that much. Next up is Dawn's Reflection. These are just 2 fertile. This is just 2 fertile grounds stapled together. It's a good card, but you don't want to see it in the early game. So it's great when you're comboing off, though, and you've got the mana, and it can really, really boost the speed at which you can combo off. So it's a good card. Next up is Petals of Insight, which is actually the infinite combo engine of the deck. You usually actually don't even need this card to win, but sometimes you do need it. So the way that this works is that since you're splicing Psychic Puppetry to untap your land, if you've got a land that's tapping for at least 7 mana, you're generating infinite mana, usually of any color as well. And so the way that this works is that you can basically just choose to put the top 3 cards onto the bottom of your library, return Petals of Insight to your hand, and then just keep playing it until you've got all the mana that you need. So, and then you can also choose to keep playing it and dig through your deck, or keep replacing the top 3 cards of your library until you find 3 that you want, like a Kyrex Torch, say, and just choose to draw it and fireball your opponent in the face when you're ready. When you are playing in paper, there is one interesting thing about this card, in that if your deck does not contain like a multiple, if the number of cards left in your library is not a multiple of 3, Petals of Insight can actually sort your entire deck for you using something that's called a bubble sort, as long as you have enough mana to do so. If your Mega Land is tapping for enough mana, then you can choose to reorder your library in any method that you choose using something called a bubble sort. For those of you that are unfamiliar with what a bubble sort is, just Google it. Basically, what it means is that since you can choose the order in which you are putting the top 3 cards back on the bottom of your library, you can actually, through many iterations of going through your deck, you can reorder the cards in any way that you choose. So some judges or players may not be very friendly to that. So, I mean, if somebody has a problem with it, you can just kind of demonstrate how it works. And you can't really do this in MTGO just because it's just such a long process, and it just takes a lot of clicks. But the general purpose for Petals of Insight isn't really to do that anyway. It's just to generate infinite mana and then maybe draw a Kyrex Torch if you need it. So last up is Kyrex Torch. It's a fireball that's got a little bit of counterspell insurance. It's good, but sometimes we wish we had Grape Shot, but that's okay. Kyric Torch will fit the bill pretty nicely. So moving on to the sideboard, we've got 3 copies of Dispel, just because Counterspell is a card in Pauper, and we need some way to deal with it. Counterspells in general are pretty tough for this deck to interact with. We just struggle sometimes in getting certain cards that are like crucial for the combo countered or something like that. So Dispel can be really nice, and you'll want to bring it in against those matchups. Giga Drowse is a card that's meant to fill a similar role in that it's to help you against control decks that run counterspells, but it's more against a control heavy deck instead of something, say, like Delver, that's more based on a tempo game. So the way Giga Drowse works is that you can essentially use it as either a pseudo silence, or if you've got enough blue, you can use it essentially as a time walk. But it's used more in the control heavy matchups, say against like blue-black flicker or something like that, where you just want to tap down all your opponent's lands and prevent them from interacting on your turn. Next up is 2 copies of Turnaside, just because since we're putting so many enchantments on one land, the possibility of us getting blown out with like a 5-for-1 or something like that, but from some land destruction or from even just a bounce spell is a really, really dangerous thing to us. So we've run a couple copies of Turnaside in the sideboard just to deal with corner cases like that. It's a pretty niche card, but this is a pretty niche deck, and we just really need a couple copies of this just to make sure that we can go through our game plan unobstructed, basically. Last blue card in the sideboard is Deep Analysis, which we aren't going to be signing in that many times against various decks, but it's really only used against decks like Mono Black Control and Blue-Black Flicker, decks that are trying to fight you for card advantage and like make you discard cards like Wrench Mind or Duress or things like that, because you don't necessarily need a critical mass of spells in your hand to win, to start comboing off, but having a lot of cards in your hand really, really helps the deck with how quickly it can combo off and things like that. So 1 Deep Analysis is there just to deal with some of the discard shenanigans. Next up is 2 copies of Glacial Ray, and it is actually sideboarded in replacement for Kyric Torch in certain matchups. It can actually replace the win condition. You just splice the the spell onto all your arcane draw cards, or you can splice it onto the Petals of Insights to deal infinite damage. But it's there actually to kill the Standard Bearer, and Standard Bearer actually completely kills this combo because Psychic Puppetry can target a permanent, which means that if Standard Bearer is on the field, we cannot untap our Mega Lands. So we have to have some way to remove Standard Bearer if it's on the field, and that's how we do it with Glacial Ray. The benefit with Glacial Ray is that it's not actually going to be hurting the consistency of our deck, really, because it's just replacing our win condition, which means that we're not going to have, we don't have any other dead cards. We're not replacing anything in the general list, if that makes any sense. So it's just not as good of a win condition, though, as Kyric Torch. It's easier to just generate a lot of mana and then Kyric Torch your opponent, whereas Glacial Ray requires a lot of arcane spells to actually do so, which means that it's not quite as good of a win condition normally. This is why we don't see it in the main board. But it does fit a function of killing Standard Bearer, so we do keep it on the side just in case. Next up is 3 copies of Tangle, just because aggro decks are our thing. Stompy, Boggles, Infect, whatever you have got that you need to deal with, Tangle is there, and it's a really, really good card for the amount of mana that you're putting in. So you're putting in 2 mana, and it's almost a double fog, but not quite. But it's really, really good. For some of you that might wonder why we run that instead of Moment's Peace, the reason that we don't run Moment's Peace is that Moment's Peace essentially gives us the same effect, although it's slightly better because it's actually 2 fogs. But it costs a total of 5 mana to do so instead of 2, and that can just really, really hurt our game plan in terms of our setup turns when we're really trying to throw down a lot of enchantments or something like that onto our land, and we just don't have the mana to spend on the flashback cost a lot of times. So Moment's Peace just is a little bit too prohibitive for us to be casting right now. which is why we run 3 copies of Tangle. And next up, we've got Vital Surge, which is just to bring in against the burn matchup. It's so good because you can basically be gaining 3 life off of any draw spell in your deck, essentially, which is just a really powerful effect. And burn essentially has no way to deal with it because it's in our hand. So it's a really good card. Sometimes burn can still steal a win off of it if they've got like double Thermal Alchemist or something like that. But otherwise, it's a pretty good card against burn. So that's the list. I hope you liked it. This is the list that I've been working on for almost 2 years now. So it's pretty fine-tuned at this point. If you have any questions, though, about it, just leave a comment or whatever. But I hope you guys liked the video, and thanks for watching.